He masterminded the plot for a king that sent Anne Boleyn to her death. 4 years later, the same king chopped off his head. The man who perfected the art of political murder became its most famous victim. Was this karma for the man who twisted England's fate forever? This is the story of Thomas Cromwell, a commoner who rose to command a king, shattered a marriage, and reshaped the kingdom in blood. But in the end, the trap he set for others snapped shut on him. Betrayal, a spiral of power that still haunts England's history. If these Tudor twists grip you, please subscribe and like the video. It helps bring more history lovers like you into our circle of royal secrets. Thomas Cromwell was born around 1585 in a world that wanted him dead. His father, Walter Cromwell, was a violent drunk who ran illegal alehouses in Putney. Court records show he was fined multiple times for beating customers and neighbors. But it was his own son who received the worst of Walter's rage. At 14, Thomas ran. He fled England with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning hatred for anyone who held power over him. But here's what made Cromwell different. He didn't just survive, he learned. Thomas joined the French army as a pikeman in 1503, marching into Italy, where he witnessed something that changed history. The fall of Caesar Borgia, one of the most powerful men in Europe. Borgia had controlled armies, commanded cities, seemed untouchable. Then his father, Pope Alexander VI, died, and within months, Borgia lost everything. Thomas watched a master manipulator destroyed by his own enemies using the exact tactics Borgia had perfected. The lesson burned into his soul. Violence wasn't enough. You needed to make your enemies destroy themselves. In the back alleys of Florence and Rome, Thomas studied more than just survival. He learned banking from Venetian merchants, mastered languages, Italian, French, Latin. Most crucially, he discovered how to read people's weaknesses and use them. When he returned to England around 1512, Thomas Cromwell was no longer that beaten blacksmith's son. He'd become something far more dangerous, a man who understood that everyone, even kings, could be broken. He built himself carefully. Cloth merchant in Antwerp's trade network, marriage to Elizabeth Wicks, a widow with connections and money who gave him 3 children and the respectability he needed. Then lawyer, building a network of people who owed him favors. Each step calculated, each friendship strategic. But Cromwell's real education came from Cardinal Wolsey around 1514. Wolsey was Henry VIII's most trusted advisor, the man who actually ran England while the young king hunted and parted. Thomas proved his worth immediately. When Wolsey needed small monasteries dissolved to fund his college, Cromwell handled the brutal details. He seized property, silenced opposition, made problems disappear with ruthless efficiency. Under Wolsey, Thomas learned the ultimate lesson: how to manage a king's impossible desires, how to find solutions for problems that seemed unsolvable, how to become indispensable. When other men saw obstacles, Cromwell saw opportunities. When nobles complained about problems, he provided solutions. Cold, efficient, brutal solutions. The scared boy who once fled his father's workshop had transformed into something terrifying, a man who could make anyone disappear. And in Tudor England, that skill would make him the most powerful person in the kingdom, except for the king himself. because Thomas Cromwell was about to meet someone who would change everything: Anne Boleyn. And their battle would end with one of them dead on a scaffold, while the other stood watching, thinking they had won. They were both wrong.
Henry VIII had a problem that was tearing England apart. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to him for 20 years, but after multiple pregnancies, only one child survived, a daughter, Mary. Without a male heir, the kingdom would collapse into civil war when Henry died. The Wars of the Roses had ended just decades earlier. Everyone remembered the blood. But divorce wasn't an option. Pope Clement VII had already refused Henry's annulment request in 1529, terrified of angering Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who'd just sacked Rome. Henry was trapped, desperate, dangerous. Other advisors had tried everything. Cardinal Wolsey had spent years begging Rome for a solution. Scholars had searched through biblical texts for loopholes. Diplomats had offered bribes, threats, and political alliances. All had failed. That's when Thomas Cromwell stepped forward with a solution so brilliant and so ruthless it would change history forever. "Your Majesty," Cromwell said in early 1530, "what if the Pope's opinion didn't matter?" It wasn't just divorce Cromwell offered Henry. It was something far more intoxicating: absolute power over his own kingdom. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry head of the Church of England. The Treason Act made it death to oppose him. In one stroke, Cromwell had freed Henry from Rome's authority and given him control over England's souls, bodies, and wealth. Henry was amazed. Finally, someone who solved problems instead of making excuses. Cromwell's reward was swift: appointment as Henry's principal secretary in 1534, then vicegerent in spirituals, essentially running the English church. Money flowed in from dissolved monasteries. Nobles who once ignored the blacksmith's son now bowed and scraped for his favor. But here's what most people don't understand about their partnership. Henry didn't just see Cromwell as an advisor. He saw him as a weapon. A brilliant, ruthless weapon that could solve any problem with brutal efficiency. In 1540, when 536 monasteries stood in Cromwell's way, he dissolved them all, seizing wealth worth millions in today's money. When the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion erupted in 1536, 40,000 Catholics demanding the monasteries be restored, Cromwell advised Henry to promise pardons, then execute the leaders anyway. Over 200 rebels died. When nobles opposed the king's religious changes, Cromwell found reasons to execute them. When laws needed changing to suit Henry's desires, Cromwell wrote new ones. Thomas Cromwell had become the most feared man in England, the king's enforcer, his problem solver, his executioner. And then he met his match, Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't like other women at court. She'd been educated in France, spoke multiple languages, and had strong opinions about everything, especially politics. While other courtiers whispered sweet agreements to whatever Henry said, Anne argued with him, challenged his decisions, treated him like an equal, not a god, and worst of all, she completely ignored Thomas Cromwell's authority. This drove Cromwell insane. Anne had married Henry in secret in January 1533, before Cromwell had even finished breaking with Rome. She had pushed for radical reforms that went further than Cromwell wanted. Their quarrels weren't about faith or family pride, they were about vision. Cromwell believed everything should strengthen the king's authority and fill his coffers. Anne believed a queen had a duty to the English people as well as her husband. She urged Henry to fund schools, help the poor, and support reformers. Cromwell saw her as reckless, meddling in matters beyond her place. Anne saw him as cold, blind to suffering. Every council meeting became a battle, not just over policy, but over what kind of England they were building. This created a deadly dynamic at court. Two brilliant, ruthless people competing for the same king's attention. For 3 years, they circled each other like wolves. Anne had Henry's heart and his bed. Cromwell had his ear and his signature. But by early 1536, Anne had made the same fatal mistake Catherine had. She'd failed to give Henry the son he desperately needed. After the miscarriage of a son in January, Henry's patience finally snapped. Cromwell saw his moment, and he struck with surgical precision. His plan was diabolical in its simplicity. He would use Anne's own friendships to destroy her. Cromwell's first target was Mark Smeaton, a young musician at court. On April 30th, 1536, Cromwell had Smeaton arrested and tortured. The exact methods remain unknown, but within hours, the terrified young man confessed to adultery with the Queen. Next came Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and Anne's close friend. Cromwell didn't need torture here, just the promise of mercy in exchange for confession. When Norris refused, Cromwell arrested him anyway. The confession would come later, he promised. Then William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Then Francis Weston, another court favorite. Finally, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, accused not just of adultery, but of incest. Cromwell's genius wasn't in creating evidence. It was in twisting normal court behavior into something sinister. Anne laughed with these men, proof of sexual attraction. She gave them gifts, payment for services. She spoke privately with her own brother, unnatural relations. Every piece of evidence was built on court gossip, jealous servants, and tortured confessions. Cromwell knew it. Henry knew it. Everyone knew it. But here's what most people don't understand. The king wanted Anne gone, and Cromwell had given him the perfect excuse. When Cromwell presented his fabricated case in May 1536, Henry barely questioned it. He'd learned to trust his enforcer's methods completely. Anne was arrested on May 2nd. Her trial was a foregone conclusion. On May 15th, Anne Boleyn was found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason, crimes punishable by death. 4 days later, Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold at Tower Green. The French executioner Cromwell had specially imported severed her head with a single stroke. Thomas Cromwell had eliminated his greatest rival using nothing but lies, torture, and a king's wounded pride. He thought he'd proven himself indispensable. He had no idea he'd just shown Henry VIII exactly how easy it was to destroy anyone, including the man who taught him how to do it.
By 1536, Thomas Cromwell had achieved the impossible. He'd destroyed Anne Boleyn, using nothing but fabricated evidence and Henry's growing hatred of his wife. 5 men died alongside her, all based on Cromwell's manufactured case: adultery, treason, conspiracy. None of it real, all of it perfectly presented. The executions were swift, clean, efficient, and Henry was grateful. Cromwell had proven something that would haunt him forever. He could convince the king of anything for anyone. But success made Cromwell reckless. For the first time in his calculating life, he began to believe his own propaganda. He thought he was untouchable because Henry needed him. He forgot the most important rule of surviving a tyrant: no one is ever truly safe. The first crack appeared when Cromwell pushed Henry toward religious reforms the king never wanted. Henry had broken with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, not to become a Protestant revolutionary. But after Anne's execution, Cromwell kept pushing. Lutheran theology, radical church reforms, the complete destruction of Catholic traditions. Henry began to resist. When Henry VIII resisted something, smart people backed down immediately. Thomas Cromwell was too blind for his own power. He didn't back down. Instead, he made his second fatal mistake. He started making decisions without consulting Henry first. By 1538, Cromwell was negotiating with foreign powers, changing religious policies, and restructuring the government as if he were king himself. He'd grown so confident in his power that he forgot he was still just a servant, a very powerful servant, but a servant nonetheless. Nobles began whispering. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's uncle, who'd survived her fall, started gathering allies against Cromwell. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who hated the Protestant reforms, began feeding Henry doubts about his chief minister's loyalty. When they complained that Cromwell was becoming too powerful, Henry began to listen. When they whispered that the blacksmith's son was getting above himself, Henry began to worry. But the mistake that would kill Thomas Cromwell was yet to come. In 1539, Henry needed a new wife. His third queen, Jane Seymour, had died in October 1537, giving birth to the son Henry desperately wanted, Prince Edward, but no partner at his side. Now the king was single again, and Europe was shifting under his feet. Old rivals, Charles V and Francis I, had put aside their conflicts and joined forces. England stood alone. Marriage was Henry's best weapon. But here's the twist. Most eligible princesses weren't eager to marry Henry VIII. His reputation was bloody, his temper infamous, and his health already failing. Several noblewomen politely declined the honor of becoming Queen of England. That's when Thomas Cromwell found what seemed the perfect solution: Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves in the German Protestant states. The marriage would strengthen England's Protestant alliance and protect the kingdom from foreign invasion. On paper, it was a brilliant strategy. In reality, it was a death sentence. Because Thomas Cromwell had forgotten something crucial about Henry VIII. The king's politics were always personal, and his personal desires always came first. Cromwell had been so focused on political advantages that he'd ignored the most important factor. Would Henry find her attractive? The negotiations took months. Treaties were signed, dowries arranged, political alliances sealed. By the time Anne of Cleves arrived in England on January 1st, 1540, backing out meant diplomatic disaster. Henry took one look at her and recoiled in disgust. She wasn't beautiful like Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. She was shy, couldn't speak English properly, and had none of the charm Henry expected. Worst of all, Henry felt absolutely no attraction to her whatsoever. But the marriage contract was signed. The alliance was sealed. The wedding had to proceed. On January 6, 1540, Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves in a ceremony he later described as the most miserable day of his life. He was trapped in exactly the same situation Cromwell had once rescued him from with Catherine of Aragon. The difference? This time, Thomas Cromwell was the one who had trapped him. Henry's rage was volcanic, private, but terrifying. He'd been forced into a loveless marriage by the same man who'd once freed him from one. The irony was perfect and deadly, but Cromwell made his final, most fatal mistake. He tried to manage the situation like he'd managed everything else. He suggested they could find grounds to annul the marriage quickly. He offered to make the problem disappear with legal technicalities. He even began investigating Anne of Cleves's background for potential loopholes. This was exactly the wrong approach. Henry didn't want solutions anymore. He wanted someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to destroy for putting him in this humiliating position. Thomas Cromwell had just shown Henry who was really making the decisions, and it wasn't the king. Every day Henry woke up next to Anne of Cleves, he was reminded of Thomas Cromwell's mistake. Every awkward conversation, every failed attempt at intimacy, Every moment of his marital misery could be traced back to one man's political miscalculation. But Cromwell's enemies weren't waiting for Henry to act. They smelled blood in the water. The Duke of Norfolk struck first. He whispered to Henry that Cromwell had deliberately deceived him about Anne of Cleves's appearance. "He saw her portrait, Your Majesty. He knew what she looked like, and he pushed this marriage anyway." Bishop Stephen Gardiner added fuel to the fire. He suggested that Cromwell's Protestant allies had used him to trap Henry in an unwanted marriage. "This was planned, Your Grace. You've been manipulated by heretics." Every conversation Henry had with his courtiers reinforced the same message. Thomas Cromwell had betrayed his trust. Meanwhile, Cromwell was desperately trying to fix his mistake. He worked frantically to find legal grounds for annulment. He interviewed Anne of Cleves's servants, searching for evidence of a pre-contract that would invalidate the marriage. He even suggested that Anne might consent to an annulment in exchange for a generous settlement. But with each attempt to solve the problem, Cromwell only reminded Henry of who had created it in the first place. Thomas Cromwell had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought Henry's anger was just another problem to be managed, another royal tantrum to be soothed with clever solutions. He had no idea that Henry's rage had moved beyond anger into something far more dangerous: cold, calculating hatred. The king didn't want the Anne of Cleves problem fixed anymore. He wanted Thomas Cromwell destroyed for creating it. And when the king wanted someone gone, he didn't need reasons. He only needed a chance.
On June 10, 1540, Thomas Cromwell walked into a Privy Council meeting expecting to discuss routine business. He never walked out. The trap closed within seconds, the same ruthless efficiency Cromwell had once employed against others. No warning, no trial, no chance to defend himself. The charges were depressingly familiar: treason, heresy, corruption, the same vague accusations that had destroyed Anne Boleyn, George Boleyn, and countless others. Henry's agents collected evidence with the exact thoroughness Cromwell had taught them. Every decision Cromwell had made was reinterpreted as betrayal. Every reform he'd pushed became proof of heresy. Every enemy he'd created suddenly found their voice. The nobles he'd terrorized lined up to testify against him. The religious conservatives he'd persecuted provided evidence of his crimes. Even his former allies abandoned him to save themselves. But here's the most brutal irony. Thomas Cromwell understood exactly what was happening. He'd perfected these techniques. He knew how hopeless his situation was because he'd made it hopeless for others. From his cell in the Tower, Cromwell wrote desperate letters to Henry, begging for mercy. The same Tower where Anne Boleyn had written her final letter. The same king who had ignored her pleas. Henry kept him alive just long enough to finalize the Anne of Cleves annulment. The king wanted his problem solved one last time before he solved the problem of Thomas Cromwell permanently. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell walked to the scaffold he'd sent so many others to before him. The executioner's axe fell on a man who'd learned too late that serving a tyrant means being expendable. His final words were a plea for forgiveness, not for his victims, but for disappointing the king who was about to kill him. The crowd probably felt justice was being served. The man who'd orchestrated fake trials and brutal executions was finally paying the price. But Thomas Cromwell's real legacy wasn't his death. It was what he'd created, a system where anyone could be destroyed with the right combination of fear, manufactured evidence, and royal approval. Henry VIII would use these methods again and again. Catherine Howard would die the same way Anne Boleyn had. So would countless nobles and anyone else who inconvenienced the king. Thomas Cromwell had created a monster of paranoia and political murder. In the end, that monster consumed its creator. The blacksmith's son had forged the weapon of his own destruction. What do you think? Was Cromwell's fate justice or just the brutal logic of Tudor politics? Share your thoughts in the comments below.